we've actually been around for a while. We're not the new kids on the block, to say the least. In fact, somebody asked about the original CCDS program, Centers for Commercial Development of Space. We were, in fact, one of those that were formed in the mid-'80s. Our mission, quite simply, has been to partner with industry, commercial entities, and to develop, to provide access to space. And our focus primarily has been life sciences and the effects of microgravity and weightlessness in particular on those things. We are based at a university. A lot of people think we're a company. In fact, we're not. And so one of the things that I'm very proud about is the fact that we have so many students that have tremendous opportunities, hands-on experience with flying payloads, putting payloads together, supporting science, even conducting science. And it's those students, of course, that are going out and becoming the next generation of entrepreneurs and people that are carrying on the work. There we go. We are part of the ISS National Lab. We have a Space Act agreement with NASA that has enabled us to continue to do research on the space shuttle and space station, and in fact have been actively involved in doing research over quite a long period of time. In fact, we have payloads that are going to be flown on STS-133, which of course, as you all know, had a number of delays. And it turns out, of course, that this being the last flight of Discovery, one of the things that we learned about that is that this is its 39th flight, and that this has really been the workhorse for the agency. As it turns out, this is also our 39th mission, so we're happy to be part of that workhorse. We're just still trying to figure out which part of the horse we are. But we are part of the National Lab and very happy to be part of it. We do focus on commercial work, but we also have the privilege of supporting more fundamental work that NASA supports. Within the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industry, if you're all familiar with their development mode, they of course develop drugs, and it starts from that early target identification, that discovery process. So one of the things that I really want to emphasize that's been discussed here today is the importance of space stations to support discovery research. And that's really where we focus. Pharmaceutical companies aren't going to be testing drugs in astronauts anytime too soon, because clinical studies obviously have to involve large numbers of people. Focus, just as with NIH, is on terrestrial disease, Earth-based diseases. And while astronauts may be interesting subjects, in fact, most of the work that's relevant to pharmaceutical and biotech companies occurs much earlier in the time frame in that discovery stage. So identification of targets and validation of those targets, identification of molecules, drugs that can interact with those targets, evaluation of toxicology, whether a drug is going to have side effects, and its pharmacology, process development, delivery methods, and demonstrating safety. These are all things that are actually done even in advance of clinical studies, even in advance of human studies, and are all things that potentially could benefit from utilizing space station. The little caricature there in the lower right is meant to show that, what happens in drug companies is they start with a number of potentially targets and a number of molecules against those targets, and develop what's called a pipeline, essentially, of products. Not everything makes it through that pipeline. By the time you get to the end of that pipeline, you're doing well if you have a good candidate that can make it all the way through. This shows that same pipeline there, and from an industry perspective and an asset perspective put together. The reason I like this slide is because it shows that the same issues that NASA is dealing with on the human research program side and trying to address astronaut health is exactly, or very analogous to the same issues that an industry would go through in developing a drug for use in patients for a particular disease. And there are different portals and different milestones that those drugs have to go through as they advance in their development and get to a stage where they can be launched, literally, into the marketplace. And I think everybody's familiar with the notion that it's extremely expensive, time-consuming. Mark mentioned that the typical development timeline for a product is on the order of 14 or 15 years. In fact, that's every bit as true, maybe more true, in the pharmaceutical industry. And as you can see here, a lot of things, a lot of candidates, a lot of targets and so forth drop out along the way, which of course simply adds to the cost. But the point is, there's two aspects that the space station can really contribute to and already are contributing to, and that is, one, anything that can be done to shorten that early timeline, that early development timeline is obviously very significant, because anything that can shorten that timeline to market is good. But the other thing is, anything that can help to ensure that something's actually going to be a good candidate when you get down to the end and you're doing clinical trials is also good. Very briefly, there are a number of applications, and I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm going to mention the ones that have little green stars there. Specifically, I'm going to give you some examples that we're currently working on, because while we're looking at the future of space station, what we're doing now and what others are doing right now, I think, paves the way very nicely, and it shows what's going to be possible in the future as we go forward. So we are, in fact, supporting the work that's already been discussed a number of times today in virulence and vaccine development. We're also doing some work in plant cell culture that I'll mention briefly. We also have been involved with and are interested in continuing to do some preclinical work with rodent models, but in bone and muscle loss, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those, and I can't possibly not actually present some specific data, so I'm going to do that in that case. These are the four that I'm going to talk about. The three that I just mentioned, and in addition, I also want to highlight some of the things that we're doing in K-12, really K-16 education, because I think that's also an exciting application, and I don't want to miss the opportunity to tell you about some of the things we're doing there. Very briefly, in vaccine development, Dr. Jeannie Becker is here and is going to be speaking tomorrow in much greater detail on this topic, so I'm not going to take the time to do so now. Suffice it to say that we have been supporting a series of flights over the last couple of years that are sponsored by AstraZeneca, which is a subsidiary, wholly owned subsidiary of AstraTech, who's collaborating with researchers at the VA Medical Center in Durham, North Carolina. And this research has really been very significant. We are looking at specific pathogens and their changes in virulence in the spaceflight environment. The two I mentioned here are Salmonella and MRSA, which have been discussed. In essence, what we're doing is testing their virulence, and we can select by identifying ones where we've knocked out specific genes that we think are relevant or that are thought to be relevant, and then flying those organisms. We can test them with a host organism. In this case, we use C. elegans as a host organism. It's a small nematode that grows to about 1 millimeter size. We have to use something like that because we haven't yet convinced the astronauts to serve as test subjects for these pathogens. But in essence, we're testing this host-pathogen response in microgravity and evaluating the virulence of a particular strain that we've identified and selected for, that the researchers have, and then utilizing those data along with ground-based studies to help advance towards an IND, an investigation of new drug application with the FDA. In the area of biofuel crop research, we're working with University of Florida. And in fact, this investigator, Dr. Wagner Andrame, is here as well, and I'm sure would be happy to explain this research to you as well, so I would encourage you to find him. But if I have this roughly correct, essentially what we're doing here is flying different strains of a biofuel plant of significant interest in the biofuel industry called Jatropha. Jatropha produces a nut that's very rich in oil, and one of the unique characteristics of this particular oil is that it does not freeze at low temperature. As you can imagine, that would be something that could work in a low temperature environment, say a jet. So the goal here is to develop strains of this crop that could be grown in more temperate climates, particularly in our country. We're interested. Right now, this is primarily grown in more tropical environments. environments. And the goal here is to develop strains, partly using microgravity as a unique environment in which the genes that affect environmental response can be evaluated, and the genes that are of particular interest here would be ones that would allow this crop to grow in conditions that can be utilized here. Muscle and bone countermeasures, I'm going to talk about a couple of examples here. We have had the privilege of partnering with Amgen, some of you may know as a very large global biotechnology company, one of the largest. We had the privilege, I'm just going to give you one past example and then one current example. In the past, we tested a compound based on the discovery of a molecule called osteoprotegerin, or OPG. It turns out this is the example that has now worked its way through the system and has now developed into a drug called denosumab. It's also now known as Prolia, which just recently gained FDA approval. It took 14 years from discovery to now being available on the market by Amgen. We had the opportunity to test this on a mission back in 2001, so it goes back a ways. But what we showed with that mission was that this compound was highly, highly effective in preventing bone loss that occurs with what really amounts to sort of the ultimate disuse environment of spaceflight. And so we tested this. It was very effective. Those data, while they certainly were not, they certainly would, whether they were gained or not gained, would not have prevented this drug from going forward, because there are a number of ground-based models that are certainly equally important to testing in space. Nonetheless, the spaceflight test data were valuable to the company because it gives Amgen the opportunity to learn about disuse specifically, and that specific disuse environment of weightlessness, and to be able to utilize those data in their FDA process as they work their way through. And incidentally, especially now that this is on the market, this is an excellent candidate for using astronauts because unlike a lot of the other anti-resorptive, what's called anti-resorptive compounds that are on the market, this is one that interferes with the natural system, the adaptation system of our bodies. The natural response that we have when we go into a weightless environment is that we don't need that much bone mass to support our structures because it's not being structurally loaded. And what this does is essentially disables that system. So temporarily, you disable the system. So for astronauts, it's a simple injection on the ground. They could go up for 6 months and not suffer probably any bone loss whatsoever. And nothing more than a simple injection in the doctor's